They never said the word to my face, not at the dinner table, not during phone calls, not even on the rare occasions I brought home a certificate or commendation, but the silence between their words always filled the room louder than anything they could have spoken. In their eyes, I was the one who hadn't lived up to the family name, the one who stood in the shadow of men who had carved their place in history with medals, stripes, and scars earned in combat zones. I was the weak link, the one who slipped through the cracks. Growing up in a military household meant structure, discipline, and expectations, not the kind that were spoken gently over warm family meals, but the kind written into your DNA. My father, a battle-hardened colonel, believed in toughness above all else. He had no patience for mediocrity and even less for emotional softness. My two older brothers were everything he had wanted them to be: lean, fast, confident, and obedient to the unspoken rules of legacy. Both had joined the Navy straight out of high school and were accepted into SEAL training before I had even picked a college major. One of them had already completed 2 combat tours overseas by the time I turned 19. They returned home with stories of firefights and fallen comrades, and I watched from a quiet corner of the living room while neighbors greeted them like celebrities and my father's chest rose just a bit higher with pride. There was no room for softness in our house. No room for excuses or second tries. You either passed or failed. And from the very beginning, I failed to fit into the mold. My interest in reading, in organizing, in noticing the details others missed, none of it mattered to my father. He only asked about how fast I could run, how much I could bench, or whether I had what it took to follow in the family tradition. He never saw me as someone capable of standing tall in a uniform. I think, deep down, he never truly believed I'd try. But I did. Not out of some deep patriotic surge, or a lifelong desire to serve. The truth is uglier than that. I enlisted because I was tired of the sideways glances from my brothers, tired of the quiet disappointment on my father's face, tired of being treated like someone who didn't measure up. I enlisted to prove that I could survive, even if I could never be celebrated. The first day of basic training stripped me down in ways I didn't expect. I had known it would be hard, but I hadn't been prepared for the endless judgment in every instructor's tone or the constant comparison to my physically stronger peers. I was smaller than most of the others. My arms burned out after just a few push-ups. I couldn't do a single pull-up without wobbling on the bar like a weak vine in the wind. My run times were pitiful. I fell behind in formation. And every mistake I made was met with a lecture, a punishment, or, worse, a sigh of disappointment that mirrored the ones I'd grown up hearing. Somehow, I thought the military might be different. It wasn't. But I didn't quit. I stayed up late studying procedure manuals. I practiced form drills alone in the early morning fog while others were still sleeping. I pushed through shin splints, low morale, and the bruises that came from trying too hard to meet standards I didn't seem built for. I passed. Just barely, but I passed. When I called home after completing basic, I expected something. Not celebration, not even praise, just a sliver of pride. Instead, my father's voice on the other end of the line was cool and unemotional, as if I had told him I'd completed a mundane chore. Support roles matter too, he said. Then there was silence. That sentence stuck with me for weeks. Support roles. That's how he saw me. Not as a soldier, not as someone who could grow into a leader, but as the invisible hands behind the curtain, moving things around while others took the credit. I laughed it off in front of my bunkmates, but inside, it gutted me more than I'd like to admit. When the opportunity came to enroll in officer candidate school, I jumped at it. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I passed, I could finally stand shoulder to shoulder with people who were respected, listened to, and seen. But I failed. Not once, but twice. The written tests overwhelmed me. I second-guessed every answer. The leadership simulations went poorly. I froze under pressure. One of the instructors even pulled me aside and told me, as kindly as he could, "You've got the heart, but not the instinct. Command presence matters more than you think." And so they assigned me to a medical logistics unit.
No combat.
No command.
No glory.
My job was to manage inventory, oversee supply dispatches, and track medical shipments on the back end. My work took place in the shadows. Far away from the battlefield, far away from any spotlight. We were the ones ensuring that med kits made it to the medics, that stretchers were cleaned and ready, that blood was stored at the correct temperature. It was critical work, but it was also invisible. To my family, it was just another reminder that I hadn't made it. Every time I called home, the tone was the same. My brothers joked about my paper-pushing gig. My father barely asked questions. So you're counting bandages now? Guess somebody's got to do the behind-the-scenes stuff. Still trying to be part of it, huh? They never meant to be cruel. But condescension doesn't need to be loud to hurt. Even among my peers, I didn't stand out. I worked efficiently, followed protocols, got the job done. But no one asked for my opinion during meetings. I wasn't invited to weigh in on strategy or briefings. I was the dependable girl in the corner who kept the forms in order and never made a fuss. I ate lunch alone more often than not because anyone disliked me, but because they didn't notice I was there. And slowly, I came to accept that maybe this was just who I was: reliable, competent, and invisible. Until the night Kandahar went dark. It started with a few scattered reports, some strange radio chatter about comms dropping, power flickering, erratic base responses. Then the power to our med unit cut out entirely. At first, we thought it was a systems glitch. But then, the sound of distant explosions tore through the sky like thunder, followed by the unmistakable roar of engines and boots stomping into our camp. Within minutes, chaos descended. Medics came rushing in, dragging blood-soaked bodies on makeshift stretchers. The injured were screaming, gasping, convulsing. Sirens malfunctioned. Lights flickered, then vanished completely. Our commander tried to get on the emergency line, but the comms were scrambled. The drone dispatch system was offline. No one knew what was going on. Everything collapsed at once. I watched my lieutenant bark half-formed orders before freezing mid-sentence. No one was organizing the incoming. Triage was falling apart. People were dying while teams screamed over each other, trying to figure out who was in charge. I saw medics break down, hands shaking, unable to perform under the pressure. I saw one of our runners, Patterson, barely 20, drop a crate of 4 bags and just stare at them like he didn't know what they were anymore. And in the middle of all that, no one looked at me. Not once. Because I wasn't the person they thought of in emergencies. But I knew things they didn't. I knew where we had backup stores. I knew which crates were mislabeled last week and where the blood units were moved after the last audit. I knew the names of every medic on that shift who had trauma experience, who had burned training, who knew how to improvise gear. And I knew that if someone didn't step up, a lot more people were going to die. So I moved. Not with authority. Not with rank. But with certainty. I didn't yell. I didn't demand attention. I didn't wave my arms and shout instructions like some drill sergeant out of a movie. I simply walked past the noise, past the panic, past the frozen chain of command and the collapsing procedures that weren't built to handle this kind of chaos. I stepped into the storm and started solving what I could, one piece at a time, with the information I had stored in my head and the calm that comes only when fear gives up and instinct takes over. The emergency power systems had failed, leaving most of the base lit only by scattered headlamps, flickering red backup lights, and the dull glow of distant fires. Without the automated drone grid, none of the supply stations were dispatching. Our entire chain of distribution, which had relied so heavily on precision tech and remote operations, had fallen apart in less than 5 minutes. What we were left with was raw, unfiltered desperation. And hundreds of wounded men and women who couldn't wait for bureaucracy to catch up. The first thing I did was grab a dry erase board from one of the admin tents, drag it to the triage zone, and mark it with quick categories: red, immediate, yellow, delayed, green, minor. Then I marked 4 corners of the camp with directional labels so anyone who saw it would know where to move patients. I picked 3 soldiers, ones who weren't injured, ones I'd seen handle themselves under pressure before, and told them to start moving patients based on wounds, arterial bleeds, chest trauma, amputations. Nothing fancy, just instinct-based decision-making. One of them looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You in charge now?" he asked, sarcasm leaking through the adrenaline. I didn't even answer. I just looked at his hands, pointed at the blood pooling near his boots, and said, "If you want that man to live, move him now. We're out of time." That was it. No arguing. He moved. The chain reaction was immediate. Patterson, the young medic who had dropped the IVs earlier, was still kneeling in the dirt, his face pale. I crouched next to him and said quietly, "The manual pump, the one we ran drills on 3 weeks ago. Remember where it is?" He nodded slowly, eyes wide.
"Go. Start it."
"Plug in every port you can. We need power to the refrigeration tents, or we lose all the blood." He didn't ask questions. He ran. The command tent was still a mess. My lieutenant was trying to re-establish contact with HQ, but no signal was getting through. The comms team was frantically attempting to reroute frequencies, while a junior officer stood near the tent flap arguing with someone over where to put the incoming casualties. No one seemed to know who was making decisions, and worse, no one was stopping long enough to look at the bigger picture. So, I didn't bother asking for permission. I knew the location of every crate in the South Depot. I knew what had expired. I knew where the backup tourniquets were, the extra batteries, the portable sterilizers. I grabbed 2 volunteers and led them through the dark by memory, using only a glow stick to navigate through the maze of tents. We loaded up a stretcher cart with what we could carry, morphine, field dressings, plasma bags, and made 3 runs back and forth before I even looked up and realized people were starting to look at me differently. Not like I was the quiet one in the corner anymore. Not like I was invisible, but like I had answers, direction, and maybe, just maybe, authority. Everywhere I turned, someone was shouting, bleeding, coughing, or crying. And yet, through it all, people began forming lines again. Medics stopped tripping over each other. Litters were organized into zones. Nurses from other sectors came running and once they saw our side of the field actually moving patients. I wrote assignments on old cardboard signs. I used duct tape to label tents by wound severity. I had no radio, no command badge, no clipboard. Just knowledge. And the will to use it. At one point, someone shoved a clipboard in my hand and said, "We're out of sterile needles in Alpha Zone. Who do I talk to?" I blinked, looked down at the blank clipboard, then looked at him. "I'm not in charge," I said. He shook his head and said, "You're the only one giving orders that are actually working." I didn't argue. I just pointed him toward the reserve crate near the refrigeration tent and kept moving. For 4 straight hours, I didn't sit down. My knees ached. My back burned. My boots were soaked with blood, sweat, and whatever filth had pooled beneath the medical cots. My uniform was stained beyond recognition. My voice had dropped into a constant, scratchy rasp, but it didn't matter. When people called out, "Where do we move this guy? Who has morphine? Where are the burn sheets?" They were calling to me. I wasn't running a unit. I was holding together a crumbling ecosystem with nothing more than muscle memory, logistical knowledge, and adrenaline. And not one person asked me for my rank. Not one. They didn't care what my personnel file said. They didn't ask how many push-ups I could do or how many failed OCS attempts I'd collected. They saw me standing there, keeping it all moving, and that was enough. I had become something I never expected. Necessary. By the time dawn cracked over the horizon, turning the sky a sickly orange over the smoke trails and scorched dirt, most of the wounded had been stabilized. The critical cases had been airlifted to the nearest trauma site. The remaining soldiers were sleeping in makeshift shelters, hooked up to IVs and oxygen tanks. The medics were passed out in chairs or curled up on blankets. No one had slept. Everyone looked like they'd aged 10 years overnight. I walked over to the mess tent and poured a half cup of stale coffee, my hands trembling so hard I spilled half of it on my boots. My limbs felt like they were made of iron. Every movement took effort. My brain was foggy. I sat down on a crate and stared at the dirt beneath my feet, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over me. There was no applause.
No ceremony.
No gathering of officers to say, Well done. The official chain of command had started to reassert itself once the satellite connections came back. The radios were up. Command was now aware of the incident. They were already planning debriefs, paperwork, damage assessments. I wasn't mentioned in any of it. Not in those first few hours. No one rushed to pin a medal on my chest. No one clapped me on the back or even said, "Thank you." People were too tired, too stunned, too focused on the next step. And I understood that. I didn't expect parades. But still, as I sat there sipping cold coffee, blood drying on my sleeves and hands, I couldn't stop the quiet question in my head. Did it matter? Had I actually changed anything? Or had I just delayed the inevitable, filled a gap that no one wanted to admit existed? Would they even remember my name by the end of the week? The air around me felt heavy, silent, and strangely hollow. I stared out at the field, watching soldiers drag hoses, wash off equipment, patch tents. The night was over, but the exhaustion in everyone's faces told me that something had broken during those hours, and we weren't going to be the same afterward. I stood up, slowly, and made my way back to the bunk tent. The sun was climbing. The sky was clearing. I stepped past a pile of spent medical packs and ducked into the narrow opening between canvas flaps. I didn't bother taking off my uniform. I didn't even unlace my boots. I lay back on the cot, stared at the ceiling for a moment, and let my eyelids fall shut. At that moment, it didn't matter that I was still nobody, that I hadn't been saluted, that no medals waited for me. What mattered was that dozens of people were still alive because I had refused to disappear. But what I didn't know, what no one had told me yet, was that someone had been watching. Not from the field, not from the tents, from above. And that someone had questions. Big ones. In the days that followed the Kandahar incident, the base didn't return to its normal rhythm, not really. People still moved from tent to tent, still completed their duties, still showed up for roll calls and carried their rifles as if everything were in order, but you could sense something hollow just beneath the surface, something unsettled. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness in the way we spoke to each other, an unspoken truth that none of us dared to acknowledge out loud. We had all walked too close to the edge that night, and even those who had returned to routine did so, with a quiet realization that the systems we had trusted could collapse in a matter of minutes, and that no one at the top had been prepared to stop it. I resumed my post as if nothing had happened, because that's what was expected of me. I reported to logistics, handled incoming manifests, checked serial numbers against rosters, and updated supply records, all while the command staff upstairs held closed-door meetings and reviewed reports I hadn't been asked to submit. No one came to interview me. No one asked for my version of events. In fact, it felt as if everyone was trying very deliberately not to mention what had occurred that night. Especially the part where an enlisted corporal with no command credentials had stepped into a void that higher-ranking officers had left empty. At first, I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe their files were disorganized. Maybe I had been logged incorrectly or missed during the first sweep of testimonies. But as the hours stretched into days and I watched nearly every other member of my unit get called in for debriefings, it became painfully clear that I hadn't been forgotten. I had been deliberately omitted. I was a complication. Because while the rest of them had followed the chain of command, or at least tried to, I had made decisions no one had authorized me to make. I had issued orders, redirected resources, and coordinated triage systems without a single formal directive. From a bureaucratic standpoint, I was a nightmare. And the simplest solution, as always, was to say nothing. So I said nothing too. I buried myself in my work, and in the quiet moments between shipments and signatures, I allowed doubt to creep in. Maybe I had overstepped. Maybe I had broken protocol. Maybe the lives saved didn't justify the rules I'd bent. That's the thing about silence. It doesn't clarify. It corrodes. On the 5th day after the attack, as I was auditing the 3rd mislabeled supply crate of the morning, a figure stepped into the tent and called my name with a kind of clipped, precise tone that told me immediately this wasn't a casual visit. The man wore the crisp insignia of a field officer, Major Rankin, if I remembered correctly, and he didn't waste time on introductions. You're Corporal Elaine Garrison? I straightened instinctively and nodded once, bracing myself for bad news. You're to report to Building C immediately. Bring your field notes. That's all. He turned without another word and disappeared through the tent flap, leaving behind only the heavy weight of anticipation and a stomachful of knots I didn't know how to untie. Building C was not a place I had any business entering. It was where the high-level briefings were held, where strategic planning was conducted, where generals came and went behind sealed doors while the rest of us stood outside and waited for their decisions to trickle down. I had only ever been near it once, and even then, I hadn't made it past the reception desk. So when I arrived and the guards outside the door merely glanced at a list, nodded, and waved me through, it didn't feel real. It felt like a mistake. Inside, the hallway was cold, sterile, and silent except for the faint hum of lights overhead. I followed the corridor until I reached a reinforced door already partially open, where I could hear the low murmur of voices from within. As I stepped through the doorway, the conversation stopped like a switch had been thrown. 12 men and women sat around a steel-plated conference table, their uniforms adorned with ranks and commendations that marked them as senior leadership. They looked up in unison, and in the moment that followed, the weight of their gaze felt heavier than anything I had carried during the triage collapse. I stood just inside the threshold, unsure if I was supposed to speak, salute, or turn around and leave. Then I saw him. At the head of the table, seated with an ease that suggested total control, was General Jonathan Lawson, 5 stars on his shoulder, every line of his face carved by decades of war and decision-making under pressure. I had seen him in briefings on television, read about him in articles, and heard his name spoken with reverence in every unit I'd ever been assigned to. He was the kind of man people described in past tense legends, even though he was still very much alive. And now he was staring directly at me. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply stood, slowly, deliberately, his height casting a long shadow over the table. And then he said it.
Mom.
Just one word. One word that should have belonged to someone else. Someone with bars on their collar and ribbons on their chest. Someone with a name people already knew. But he had said it to me. He had stood in a room full of brass and addressed a logistics corporal, a nobody, as if I were the one with rank. For a second, I thought I might pass out. My throat tightened, my knees weakened, and for a terrifying moment, I forgot how to breathe. Somehow, I managed to take one step forward and offer a nod, my voice barely more than a whisper when I said, "Corporal Elaine Garrison reporting, sir." Lawson held my gaze for a moment longer before gesturing to the empty seat at the far end of the table. "Have a seat, Corporal. We've been reviewing your work." As I sat down, stiffly, awkwardly, painfully aware of every sound I made, Lawson opened the manila folder in front of him and laid out several documents on the table: satellite images, medical supply logs, heat maps from the blackout period, drone footage transcripts, field communications data. My name appeared on nearly every page. "For the past 72 hours, he began, his voice calm but commanding, our operations team has been analyzing every minute of data collected during the Kandahar crisis. While the base's automated systems were compromised, an alternative field response structure emerged, one that operated with remarkable precision given the circumstances." He looked at the others around the table, then returned his focus to me. That structure was not the result of command protocols. It was not the product of a coordinated officer strategy. In fact, by every technical metric, the chain of command failed to respond effectively. But something else happened. He turned one of the pages around so that I could see it, handwritten notations scrawled across a triage map that I recognized immediately. They were mine. "You," he said, "created and executed a functioning medical logistics grid in real time, without clearance, without oversight, and without error. Your decisions reduced casualty processing time by 48%, doubled equipment efficiency across 3 sectors, and directly contributed to the survival of at least 34 critical patients." He paused. "Is there a reason none of that was in your formal report?" I looked down, embarrassed. "I wasn't asked to write one, sir." That answer shifted something in the room. Several officers exchanged quiet glances. Lawson closed the folder and leaned forward. Well, you're being asked now. Another officer, someone with the eagle of a full colonel, cleared his throat. Sir, if I may, her actions, though effective, were outside her designated role. There's concern that Lawson raised a hand and silenced him instantly. Her actions saved lives. In my book, that's the only designation that matters. He turned back to me, and I saw something new in his eyes. Something I had never seen in any officer, teacher, or even family member who had evaluated me before.
Respect.
Not pity. Not surprise. Not vague tolerance disguised as professionalism. Genuine, earned respect. Lawson tapped the folder again. You're being temporarily reassigned to Joint Ops. I want you working directly with our emergency response doctrine team. We're rewriting the protocols based on what you did out there, and I need the person who built it to be in the room.
He paused.
And if you ever want to take another shot at officer school, let me know. Personally, the air left my lungs all at once. For a second, I forgot where I was. My hands trembled on the table, and I forced them to stay still, afraid that if I moved too quickly, the moment would vanish. Then I stood. I didn't salute. I didn't speak. I just looked General Lawson in the eye and extended my hand. He took it without hesitation. And in that simple gesture, I felt something shift in the core of who I was. Because for the first time in my entire life, someone at the very top had seen me, not as a failure, not as a disappointment, not as someone who couldn't quite measure up, but as exactly what I had always tried to be. A soldier. A leader. Someone who mattered.